The first time Innocent mentioned the idea of building a family house, it came out like a shy confession, sandwiched between a sigh and the clatter of rain. The roof of their rented place had started leaking again. A slow, plinking betrayal into the bowl Anita had pushed under the worst drip. The children were asleep on the mattress they all shared, feet splayed in dream forgetfulness, and the smell of damp crept into the curtains. Innocent rubbed his palms together, the way he did when he was thinking of something big but uncertain. "Anita," he said, eyes on the ceiling as if speaking to the water itself, "one day we will build our own house. Not a grand palace, just a good house. A place that does not drip on our dreams." Anita looked at him, at the weariness holding up his shoulders like a heavy yoke, and felt a steady flame kindle in her chest. She was the kind who counted the beans before cooking, who stretched stew with extra tomatoes and still made it sing. "We will," she said simply, as if she had already placed a brick. She stood up, moved the bowl 2 inches to catch a new thread of leakage, and began to plan. They had met years earlier when Innocent came to fix the faulty wiring in the small salon where Anita apprenticed. He was an electrical technician at a bottling plant off the highway, the type who knew exactly which wire not to touch with wet fingers. He had laughed easily then, and Anita, with straight pins in her mouth and hair cream on her hands, found herself laughing too. In those first months of marriage they lived on late dinners, church on Sundays, and shared dreams folded like spare wrappers in the top drawer. Then came the children, first Nkem, then Kosi, and the wrappers became rags for wiping small foreheads. The dreams remained but needed washing and sunlight again. Money was the first test, the second, the third. Money was always a test. Innocent brought home pay from his shifts, and some months he picked up night work installing ceiling fans in new shops. The plant did not pay much, and sometimes they paid late, so Anita revived the skill that had always been her quiet pride. She borrowed a second-hand sewing machine from their neighbor Mama Chica, promising to mend her wrapper hems for a month in return. She set the machine in the corner of their sitting room, next to the window with the most light. The machine's pedal answered the children's breathing at night. The needle sang. Anita's fingers learned to race again, to coax a straight line out of stubborn fabric, to turn a small profit into school fees and soap. She added little hustles and watched how small streams become rivers. On Fridays she made bottles of Zobo and ginger drink. On Saturdays she fried chin-chin and placed them in transparent bags with a neat label, Anita's Kitchen, written in blue pen. She joined a women's AHO, a rotating savings group that met every 2 weeks in the church compound under the mango tree. The treasurer used a tin box with a stubborn lock. Anita loved the sound of each contribution dropping inside, kunk, like a promise that would soon be her turn. When it was her turn, she did not buy a new wrapper, though her eyes had lingered on a beautiful Ankara print in the market. She bought cement and smiled all the way home. They kept a colo, a wooden savings box, under their bed, a secret bank whose key slept in Anita's wrapper. They named the box House, just to remind themselves that this sacrifice had a face. Innocent taped a piece of paper on the inside of their wardrobe and wrote, in block letters, brick by brick. Every week they wrote how much they'd saved. Some weeks it was only coins. Other weeks it was enough to make their hearts lift. The children learned the slogan and would shout it when Anita came home from the market, brick by brick. They didn't fully grasp what it meant, but they loved the way it sounded, like a drum pattern from a festival. Finding land felt like chasing a shadow with a sieve. They trudged after agents across dusty edges of town, past cassava fields and half-formed estates with signboards full of promises. There were plots with shaky papers, plots with neighbors who quarreled over boundaries, plots where an uncle appeared whenever money was mentioned. Anita was the one who asked the steady questions. Who measured this land? Where is the survey? Who signed? She learned the difference between a deed of assignment and a careless handwave. She made photocopies and carried them in a transparent file, then took them to an older cousin, a quiet clerk in the land registry, to read and confirm. Innocent watched her with a mixture of awe and tender worry. He had always known she was smart, but watching her negotiate with men who thought they could tangle her with big words made him fall in love with her again, differently. When they finally found a plot, a sloping rectangle of earth with 2 stubborn neem trees and a view of the road, they took a breath neither had realized they were holding. The day they signed the papers, Innocent hugged Anita so tightly she squeaked. He went to the site and scooped up a handful of red earth, then poured a little into Anita's palm when she joined him. "This is ours," he said. "It's not much yet, but it will hold us." Anita closed her fingers around the earth and slipped it into the pocket of her wrapper as if the land was a small miracle she could keep close to her body. They prayed with Pastor James at the site one early morning, roosters arguing in the distance. Pastor James sprinkled water and oil, spoke words about foundations and read from Psalms. He told them to remember that a house is more than walls. Anita stored that line beside the other words she loved, brick by brick. A house is more than walls. The neem trees waved their thin branches like old aunties clapping along. The first dig was a kind of joy even though it was back-breaking. Innocent and two of his friends from the plant did most of it, slipping into work clothes at the end of night shifts and coming to the site with pickaxes that protested at the hard ground. Anita brought food in a blue cooler and water in a yellow jerrycan. Sometimes she rolled up her sleeves and joined. She learned to carry blocks balanced on her palm, pressing them against her shoulder with a little hop that made the weight easier to manage. The foreman they could afford then was a thin man called Sola who spoke more with his hands than his mouth. He liked Anita because she paid on time and asked intelligent questions. He liked Innocent because he worked like a man who respected sweat. "Madam," Sola said one afternoon, wiping his forehead with a faded handkerchief, "you know this job pass some men way day call themselves client." Anita grinned and gave him cold zobo. When the trenches were open and the foundation layout traced with string, a storm arrived couple of days too early, the sky turning the color of bruised eggplant. The rain tried to erase their lines, to swallow their trenches whole. Innocent watched the water gather and felt panic rise in his throat like bile. All that work, all those hours, dissolving. He stood in the rain, hands on his head, like a man watching a dream slip through his fingers. Anita ran to him, rain whipping their faces, and cupped his cheeks. "Look at me," she said, loud over the drum of water on earth. "We will do it again. If the ground asks us to prove we belong here, we will prove it. We will build again, stronger. You hear?" He swallowed. "I hear." The next day, under a pale sun, they returned with shovels and buckets and began again. There were moments when it seemed the world measured their patience with a ruler and kept adding inches. The price of cement jumped twice in 1 year, as if it had a mind of its own, and the cost of sand followed greedily. The bottling plant reduced hours for a quarter, and Innocent, for the first time since he started there, brought home a brown envelope with less than they needed. Anita felt her stomach drop, then level like a boat hitting a wave. She took more sewing orders, uniforms at the start of term, then a small contract to make aprons for a new bakery. She asked for referrals and offered free alterations to the wives of men at the site. Her machine ran hot, her fingers ached. She turned off the light after midnight and woke before dawn to soak beans for moi moi she would sell in white plastic bowls balanced on a tray. The house drank everything and asked for more, but Anita did not resent it. Inside her grew a fierce tenderness for what they were birthing. They learned tricks of the building trade the hard way. Buy the sand early in the season before the roads flood and trucks make excuses. Make friends with the block maker. Negotiate price per block and pay a portion in advance when you know a price rise is coming. Count your blocks. Thieves come at night with a wheelbarrow and quick feet. Lock your iron rods with chain. Men might borrow what is not theirs. One night, their watchman fell ill and left early. By morning, 3 stacks of blocks were gone. Innocent felt anger flicker like a match and wanted to burn the world. Anita placed a bowl of Gary before him, poured in cold water, added milk powder with a little smile she could not summon with ease. "Eat," she said. "We will add back what they took. Nothing good leaves this world unnoticed. It will come back to us in another way." He ate and calmed. That afternoon, 2 women from church arrived with a small envelope, an anonymous donation they said for the house. The amount was exactly the market cost of the stolen blocks. Anita pressed the envelope to her chest and let her tears fall onto it, 2 drops like commas in a sentence of gratitude. Family had their opinions, of course they did. Innocent's mother worried before she approved. She had grown up in a generation that believed landlords were small gods to be appeased. "Will you people not offend your landlord with this your ambition?" she asked one Sunday when they visited. "Ah, Mama," Anita said, laughing gently, "if we must offend someone, let it be the rain or the sun. The landlord will be fine." Over time, even Mama began to boast in her market about "my children who are building." Anita's own older sister, stern and practical, warned her not to let the house consume their marriage. "Big projects become third partners," she said. Anita listened, and at night, when she and Innocent lay side by side, she made a habit of reaching for his hand in the quiet. They created small oases, eating roasted corn outside, listening to the generator hum from far-off compounds, sharing stories about the day. She refused to let the house become a wall between them. As the walls climbed, so did their hope. The rooms took shape. Anita stood in the rectangle that was to be the kitchen and closed her eyes to see it finished. A counter where she would roll dough without balancing her bowl on a stool, a deep sink that did not cough and sputter, a window that gave light without giving rain. Innocent stood in what would be the boys' room and imagined marking their heights on a door frame, watching the pencil lines climb over the years. They argued sometimes about details. He wanted a little veranda running the length of the front. She worried the cost would steal their paint. He wanted green paint. She preferred a gentler cream. They managed to quarrel and compromise without letting bitterness settle like dust. When one of them raised the voice, the other lowered theirs. They remembered their slogan. Brick by brick also meant piece by piece. There were days when Anita stood at the site with a baby on her back, neighbor's child she was helping to mind, and a list in her hand. She learned to read quantities, how many bags of cement for plastering a room, how to calculate square meters of tiles and not be cheated, why wiring should happen before plastering, why you never pay for all the windows at once. She slept with a pen near her pillow. More than once, she woke to scribble a figure she'd remembered in sleep. She refined a budget until it was a living creature. Cut here, add there, move this money from flour to nails. She stopped buying suya on Sundays. Innocent stopped taking Okada to work and walked most days to save fares. They collected leftover stones by the roadside to harden their compound. They learned that sacrifice, when chosen together, becomes a kind of intimacy. When the roof finally went up, corrugated sheets that winked under sun, the house changed from a hopeful skeleton to a body with a beating heart. The children ran from room to room, their voices echoing in cement and laughter. Anita stood in the doorway and used her wrapper to dab her eyes. Innocent put an arm around her. "We are almost there," he whispered. "Almost," she said, her mouth trembling into a smile. They had learned the most sacred skill, how to live inside, almost, without letting it break you. Finishing work took the kind of patience that rubs smooth the inside of your mouth. The electrician came and disappeared. They found another who measured twice and cut once. Tiles were cheaper in one market and better in the other. Windows would be ready next week, and arrived 2 weeks later with a small chip Anita caught and insisted they replace. The painter tried to thin the paint with too much water. Anita stood in the sun, arms crossed, and made him repaint. By then, the men at the site had stopped calling her Madam, with the tone they reserve for women to be humored. They spoke to her as if she was one of them, which in truth she had become. Of course, life insisted on inserting itself. Kosi fell ill with malaria during Harmattan, burning with a sudden fever that made Anita forget the house for 3 days and 3 nights, except to pray in cracked whispers. They spent money on tests and drugs without counting. What is a house beside a child's breath? When Kosi sat up and asked for bread, Anita nearly laughed into tears. They returned to the site the next week, a little thinner, a little more grateful. Innocent developed a back strain from lifting too many cement bags. Anita scolded and massaged him with hot water and balm and took over the lighter loads. "I'm supposed to be your protector," Innocent said, feeling foolish and tender. "Allow me to protect you by scolding you," she replied, dimples flashing. They both laughed. The back healed. When the floors finally gleamed and the windows shut properly and the doors took their locks with a satisfying click, they planned the move in a frenzy of lists. The house did not have everything. No fancy chandelier, no imported fridge, but it had the necessities and the quiet that comes from walls that are yours. Anita scrubbed from dawn to dusk, singing under her breath, moving from room to room like a blessing in motion. Innocent planted a small ube pear tree near the fence and a young pawpaw beside the kitchen. "For the children," he said, "so they can learn that good things grow." They moved in on a Saturday, the kind of day the air tastes like clean water. Friends carried chairs, cousins carried pots, someone's car radio played old highlife songs, and the neighbors peeped through their gates and smiled. Anita had cooked jollof rice that made its own announcement, fried plantain that was neither burnt nor shy, and okra soup so silky even the men who swore they didn't like okra were licking their spoons. Pastor James came with a small crowd from church to pray again, words of thanksgiving this time, words that recognized the ghosts of nights they had wept in secret. Innocent's mother stood in the sitting room and shook her head slowly, then wiped her eyes with the edge of her wrapper. "God has shamed my doubt," she said. "Forgive me. This is beautiful." When the guests left and the house grew quiet in its newness, Anita walked barefoot from room to room, touching walls with the back of her fingers. Innocent followed, holding her hand. They ended on the veranda as the sun sank like a prayer answered in slow motion. "Thank you," he said, voice thick, "for not letting me give up that day it rained. For turning fabric and ginger and beans into blocks and iron. For being the one who remembered that a house is more than walls." Anita leaned her head on his shoulder. "We did it together," she said. "But I am glad you saw me." They sat that way until darkness turned on its stars. In the months that followed, the house began to understand its assignment. It learned their footsteps, the rhythm of school mornings and Sunday dressing, the laughter that rolled down the corridor after dinner, the hush that settled for homework. Anita set up a sewing table by the kitchen window, and the sound of her machine became part of the house's soundtrack. Innocent's toolbox lived in a corner of the store. He fixed loose screws and tightened wobbly chairs like a man who had been waiting to attend to something that was finally his.